when they called out and said, we're going to follow Abu Sufyan and the Quraysh, the kuffar of the Quraysh back to Mecca, some of the munafiqeen in Medina, they started to try to intimidate the believers. And they tried to make them become scared. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this incident. الَّذِينَ قَالَ لَهُمُ النَّاسِ إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمِعُوا لَكُمْ فَخْشَوْهُمْ فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا. Allahu Akbar. So the munafiqeen who were part of the Muslim community, they were internal, they weren't an external enemy. They said, إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمَعُوا. That verily Abu Sufyan and the army of Quraysh, they have a big army. And they have gathered. So فَخْشَوْهُمْ. So fear them. Don't go out. Don't go chase them. You just fought a battle. Why would you go out again? فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا. Subhanallah. So for the believers, the opposite effect happened. When they tried to be intimidated and tried to be scared, their iman actually increased. And they became more resolute and more firm. And they said, وَقَالُوا حَسْبُنَا اللَّهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ. Subhanallah. And then they made this prayer. And a prayer that all of us should make in the month of Ramadan. And they said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sufficient for us. And He is the best of protectors. And this is something I would encourage all of us to say. And to teach these Quranic prayers. MashaAllah, many of you are coming to Taraweeh. Many of you are coming here to Fajr Salat. We hear the Quran. We benefit from it. And part of it is to do the tadabbur on the Quran and to teach it to our families and to one another. And one of the traditions I try to do in my family after our prayers, we recite one of these Quranic prayers. And this is one of them. Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sufficient for us. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the last two verses for today describes what happened. So in the seerah literature, we know that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he called out on Sunday, and then he moved the army for 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. They went to a place called Hamara al-Asad, which is about 8 miles away from Medina. So they went and they followed the Meccans and they scared them and they ran after them and they stayed in this one locale and they lit many fires, showing that their army was strong. So Abu Sufyan, his initial plan was, I'm going to go back to Mecca and then come back with an even greater army and destroy them. But then, as they started following them, and they saw that the Muslims were so strong, he abandoned that plan, and he stayed in Mecca. So then, the Muslim army, they went back to Medina. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this and says, فَانْقَلَبُوا بِنِعْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَفَضْلٍ لَمْ يَمْسَسْهُمْ سُوءٌ وَاتَّبَعُوا رِضْوَانَ اللَّهِ. Subhanallah. So they went back to Medina by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by the ni'mah, the blessing. And there was no harm that touched upon them. Subhanallah. There was no battle. They didn't fight Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan didn't come out. He became scared. And they followed the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wallahu dhu fadlin azim. And then this is the last verse and the lesson for us. إِنَّمَا ذَلِكُمُ الشَّيْطَانِ يُخَوِّفُ أَوْلِيَاهُ. Subhanallah. This is what shaitan does. He comes and he whispers and he tries to scare the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The ones that love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the friends of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, trying to be Muslims, submit themselves to have iman. Wallah, then is وَلَا تَخَافُوهُمْ وَخَافُونِي. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't be afraid of those enemies. Don't be afraid of shaitan. وَخَافُونِي. Be afraid of me. إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. Subhanallah. If you truly are believers. And this is a beautiful ending to this verse because it ties iman with khawf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the questions we have to ask as believers, as mu'min, is what is iman? وَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا. That their iman increased. All of us want to have strong iman. But the iman is connected to what? Fearing Allah, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something that we can work on in this beautiful month of Ramadan, is to examine our fears. Because shaitan, what does he do? He comes and he knows your fears. Your fear of losing your job, your fear of losing your family, fear of a risk, sustenance, food, fear of war, of hatred. So because of these fears, we don't act. We don't act in a bold and courageous way. And we become frozen. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't fear shaitan. Don't let him make you scared. Rather, say, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sufficient, and He is the best of protectors. In kuntum mu'mineen. If you are truly believers, we would only fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see that here in this circumstance, in this case, the munafiqeen were saying, don't go out though, they're going to hurt you, they're going to harm you, you're going to lose, you're injured. But nothing happened. And this is something that I even personally reflect. There's so many times I was afraid to do something because of the consequences. But when I did it, there was no consequence. It was only goodness. Only khair from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So brothers and sisters, to conclude, we see there's 3 beautiful lessons in this particular 4 verses of the Quran. First, we see how quickly things can change. In Uhud, at one moment, the Muslims had lost. That the archers had gone down from Uhud. Khalid bin Walid had come around. The Muslims were in disarray. They went back to Medina. Everything was gone. But then the next day, subhanAllah, the next day, this was Saturday. Next day, we're going to go after the disbelievers. We're going to scare them. We're going to make sure they don't come back. And they went. And this is something about the believer. Yes, one day may be difficult. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we've woken up today. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this day has put our soul back. So if something went wrong yesterday, inshallah we have today to make it right and to make it better. The second thing is not to be intimidated. SubhanAllah, I see this so many times within myself and others. People will come to you and they'll make you scared. Don't you think about this? Don't you think about that consequence? Aren't you afraid of that? And they play on your fears, your insecurities. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't let shaitan do that. He tries to do the yukhawifu awliya Allah. He tries to come and scare the friends of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, awliya. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَخَافُوهُمْ. What? وَخَافُونِي. Be afraid of me. As believers, in kuntum mu'mineen, your fear is only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing in this dunya and this earth. And lastly, we see in this very particular circumstance, this one moment in the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, we see a beautiful dua come out. And this is one of the amazing aspects of the Quran, is that it's revealed during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, when he was 40 until he passed away. And during the movement of the believers. So you might say, oh, this is only to that community. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us spiritual lessons from the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And He gives us dua. And the month of Ramadan is a month of dua. It's a month of building your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is one of the du'as. This is one of the statements we say as believers. Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are sufficient for us, and you are the best of protectors. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. Wal asr, inna al-insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat, wa tawasaw bil haqqi, wa tawasaw bis sabr. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.